All right, so our next speaker today is Dr. Tim Miller-Morgan. He is an assistant professor at Oregon State University, where his primary role is providing educational programming and service to the aquarium industry and beyond in Oregon. And he was also instrumental in developing a new 2-year Aquarium Science track degree program at Oregon Coast Community College. Today his talk is Protecting Your Fish and Inverts from a Dangerous World, Principles of Biosecurity, Fish Health, and Management. So let's welcome Tim to MACNA.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me, and it's been real fun. I've actually been able to meet up with a number of my former students, which is good and makes me feel old. What we're going to talk about today is sort of the general principles of fish health management and biosecurity. And obviously in 45 minutes, we can't cover everything, so I'm going to just talk about sort of the general principles and things to think about, kind of how I think about it. One of the things that I've discovered, but also frequently accused of, is that veterinarians tend to look at the world a little differently, maybe a little more pessimistically. So you'll get to see a little bit of my view about kind of managing things. I guess not that things are bad, but that just I always think of a worst case scenario. So, it's working. So you actually probably have seen this. Dr. Ryan just actually put one of these pictures up. And so, here you've got, this image is actually showing distribution networks and import into the United States the sources of fish, of marine ornamental fish and invertebrates. So when I look at this, though, I see disease risks. I see things that need to be managed. And that's how I look at kind of any sort of supply chain or anything like that, because I'm a vet, and that's usually what people are asking me to do. So when I look at that, I see potential diseases, potential problems with health management through the chain of custody that need to be addressed, that kind of thing. So I look at that. So I think about that, and then I think about a facility I'm working with, and then I begin to wonder what's in your tank. And just as a little aside, I should mention the guy in the background there, that's my brother. We're so proud. And the woman is his wife. So, but anyway, you've all seen your fish come in, and you've seen some of these things. You've seen trauma, you've seen evidence of an infectious disease, cryptocardia, and you've seen, evidence of parasite infection, that kind of thing. But oftentimes what we forget is that there also can be a lot going on inside of the fish that may not manifest itself right away, but we can oftentimes pick up on exams. So these are basically images that I shot and a video of fish that we've looked at coming into a facility. And these are all marine ornamental fish and all different types of lesions that we might see that suggest there's something that needs to be managed. But if we hadn't looked at them, we wouldn't have seen this. We can see, and now this is, let's see if it'll play. There you go. So this is another internal exam. Now, this is a freshwater fish, but I just put it up because it's cool, and I've seen stuff like this in marine ornamentals. So this is, it's a very small fish, and we've taken all the GI out and laid it on 2 slides and put it up, and I just took my iPhone and filmed this. So what you're seeing here is multiple roundworms. We're seeing protozoans in here. We're seeing some encysted nematodes, or roundworms and trematodes and flukes. So kind of gross. As a veterinarian, I go, wow, that's so cool. Anyway, but all manageable if we know it's there. So, and I've seen this kind of situation in marine ornamental fish as well. All right, stop. Invertebrates, we're not as evolved in terms of managing health disease or understanding disease in invertebrates, but we see certainly the same things. Trauma, we see animals start to break down after they've been in a facility for a while. We see with crustaceans, shell disease develop, that kind of thing. We're learning more and more about these animals, and in fact, one of the things we're doing at our facility is beginning to develop sort of what are normal parameters. So for instance, we just developed a whole normal blood values or hemolymph values for some species of sea stars. Because if you don't know what's normal, then how do you figure out what's going on if you're having a problem? So these are invertebrates we need to think about as well. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is that before I came to this meeting, I was at another one in Prince Edward Island, which is the International Symposium for Aquatic Animal Health. And it's, I jokingly call it the Aquatic Animal Health Olympics. It happens every 4 years, and kind of all the big players come in and give talks. And ornamental fish were prominently discussed, because there's some really interesting research that's going on now, and diseases that are being identified that they haven't been able to identify in the past because we didn't have the technology to do it and the techniques. So this is just a list of the emerging diseases that we're seeing in the ornamental fish industry right now. Some are re-emerging. The ones in yellow are the ones that we've identified in a number of marine ornamental fish species. And I just put that up there just so you can be aware that there are new things that are coming out along, and we have better technology to identify this, and as we refine that, we'll have diagnostic testing so that we can pick this up and manage it. So it's pretty obvious that prevention is generally always cheaper than treating. If you can prevent that problem ahead of time, that's really important. And a lot of facilities that I work with, I'll jokingly kind of say, I'll come in and I'll say, you know, if I actually have to work as a veterinarian, then we've failed somewhere. So one of my jobs is to work myself out of a job, which is to find where our weak points are and figure out how we can mitigate that. Why do we want to do that? Well, if you're a business, you want to increase or maintain profits. You want to reduce your losses and your costs. As you know, you've heard the last couple days, we have increased regulatory scrutiny. There's increasing welfare concerns now. There's emerging and foreign diseases that we need to worry about. There's zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that the animals can carry that can pass to us. There are a few of those. The risks are generally pretty low, but if anyone's interested in what those are, we can talk about them later. And then there's the issue of a sustainable industry. If you don't have good health management throughout the chain of custody, you really can't have sustainability, in my opinion. So that's another reason that we want to look at health management. So what is health management and biosecurity? I actually equate them. If you're doing good biosecurity, you're doing good health management. If you're doing good health management, you're doing good biosecurity. It's all the practices designed to prevent disease amongst your animals. And then has two major goals. One is to maximize the immunocompetence of the fish, or the invertebrates, or the populations, and then reduce or eliminate your potential disease agents or disease-causing factors. So I break that up into two areas. We develop protocols. Biosecurity are basically the protocols you use to meet those previous goals. So I break that up into two areas: pathogen exclusion and pathogen containment. And if you have both of those, you bring those together, then if you have a good program, you're reducing mortality, you're reducing your costs, your customers are happier, the regulators are happier, and then you have an improved industry perception too. And that's something we talked about yesterday. So let's talk about each of these two aspects of biosecurity. I like to think of pathogen exclusion, or I like to think of biosecurity as a castle. Pathogen exclusion is the outer walls of your castle. It's all the procedures you put in place to keep the diseases from getting in. Pathogen containment would be equivalent to the walls within the castle to prevent the attackers from moving through the facility easier, or the castle easier. So your containment procedures are the things you put in place to contain a pathogen in a particular area of your facility once it gets in. So let's talk about pathogen exclusion first. The first thing you want to do is identify your goals. What are you trying to do? And typically what you're trying to do is you want to be able to produce or maintain healthy fish, and you want to keep out certain diseases. You'd like to keep out all diseases, but anyone who's kept fish or invertebrates knows that that's not possible. But you need to set your goals realistically, and setting your goals also depends on what are your resources, what are your financial resources, your human resources, your logistical capability. All that comes into play. Then we have to identify the appropriate standards. I want to keep these diseases out. Okay. Are there tests? Can we screen for that? if we can screen for that, are those tests easily accessible? Are they affordable? If they're not affordable, is there something else we can do? So we need to look at all of those things. And you also need to look at the standards of the region or the state or the country that you're in. There may be specific requirements for disease screening before they come in. So for instance, here in the States, if you're bringing in, I'm going to use a freshwater example, but if you're bringing in koi or goldfish, they have to come with paperwork that says they have been certified free of spring viremia of carp virus. Okay? So that's a standard, and you need to make sure that your suppliers are meeting that standard or they don't come in. Then we need to identify specific risks. Now, there's a way to do that. A common way to do it has been started for use in the food industry, and it's expanded, and that's doing a HACCP analysis. Anyone familiar with that? HACCP means Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point. And what it is evaluating a supply chain, a production process, and looking at where are your most critical risks that impede successful function of that process, or where are your most critical areas where we can have disease come in. You can identify all of them, but you have to, what you want to do is identify the most critical areas where addressing that you get the most bang for your buck. Because you cannot eliminate all risk. It's not possible. So you want to basically reduce your risk as much as possible by doing this kind of analysis. And we've basically done it already in broadly within the industry, and each facility is different. And then, and I mentioned this before, you want to identify specific pathogens. Are there specific disease agents that you must keep out or you want to keep out? And then that are really a dramatic concern. So again, I'll use a freshwater example because I've done a lot of work in that particular area, is koi herpes virus. How many of you are familiar with that? Okay, a few of you are. So this is a virus, if it gets into your facility, you can lose in about 14 days 80% of your stock, okay? So keeping that out is really important. Keeping out something like ick maybe not be as important, okay? So you need to prioritize that as well. So here is kind of a graphic of what a HACCP pulls up when you're looking at the biggest risks to a facility or your home tanks or anything like that. So first there's the fish or the invertebrates themselves. They can bring diseases in. Then there's the food you bring in or you're producing. And there's the equipment you're using. Especially if you have multiple tanks, multiple areas, you can move diseases around on the equipment. If you have employees, do they have tanks at home? They could potentially bring in diseases. Where's your water coming from? Is it surface water? Is it municipal water? Is it chlorinated? How's it treated? If it's well water, there can be risks with that. Then, if you have customers that come in, how much ability do you give them to interact with the animals? That's a potential risk as well. And then we need to also look at where's our water going when we're done, when you're done with it. Is it going into a municipal system where it's going to be chlorinated and dechlorinated, or is it going back into the natural system? We may need to think about that. So if we're talking about our sources of animals, the easiest way to reduce our risk is to limit the number of suppliers. The smaller your number of suppliers, the less your risk. Seems pretty obvious. But then you need to determine what is the health of the fish coming from the suppliers? What do your suppliers do to manage fish health? And this is where we heard this morning, and Chris Berner mentioned it yesterday, this is where this whole concept of transparency comes into play. What are your sources, your fish and animal sources, doing to manage disease, and how willing are they to share that with you? The other thing is that if they are certified free of disease, what is the testing standards that they're using? There's really only one globally recognized testing standard, and that's the OIE, the World Animal Health Organization. They actually set standards for diagnosing most of the most serious and important diseases that we worry about. The US has another standard that we use, but slowly we're switching over to these OIE standards. But there are a number of companies that sell fish that I've seen that have these beautiful certificates that say, oh, they're guaranteed to be free of disease. You can't do that. There's always going to be disease agents in the fish. If the fish is healthy, a lot of those disease agents aren't ever going to be a problem. So you need to understand that there's always some risk with those animals coming in, and if you get a health certificate with them, you need to determine by what standards was that health certificate signed. How are they testing the fish? What are they using? What are the protocols? Then there's your water supply. I alluded to that already. Where is it coming from? Is it, if you're surface water or your well water or your municipal water, there are risks that can be associated with that, and you need to look into those risks. Then there's our food source. We want good quality food for our animals. Everybody wants that. But then we also need to think about, is it stored properly? Was it prepared properly? Was it ever allowed to get moist? Was it ever frozen and thawed and refrozen again? We need to think about that. If you're buying live food, you may want to look at those food sources. We've had a couple of situations where the live food we were feeding introduced disease agents into a system. So we need to think about that as well. If you're producing your own live food, as long as you have good protocols, you're going to have a lower risk than if you're buying, but you need to periodically check your live food too. Even algae, we've had overgrowth of bacteria, and as you're feeding out the algae, you can be putting bacterial agents into your tanks. Then we need to think about the people. Now, I'm sorry I don't have any marine-oriented pictures here, but these are really good to illustrate the point. This industry has lots of people. They're moving around. They're looking at fish. We have customers that come in. If you're a big wholesale facility or an import facility, you may have customers coming in. They may be picking their own fish, or they may not. These are all things we need to think about. And if you don't know where those individuals have been before, if they had their hands in other tanks or ponds and then they're moving to another area, they can potentially spread disease. So here's a couple examples. The top left there is a big koi facility in Japan. And you're actually seeing 3 groups of people there from 3 different countries. Each of those groups has visited 4 to 6 farms before they came here, and they're catching their own fish up. So there's some potential risks. This particular facility, there was no hand washing station or foot baths or anything before you came in, which are things that I tend to think about. So that's a risk. And then in the top right-hand picture, that truck is a truck that moves fish around from ponds back to holding facilities and things like that. That truck just spends its whole day moving fish from different farms to their holding facilities and goes on to another farm. So we need to think about, is that disinfected properly? And then the individuals that work on that truck, they're moving fish and moving from farm to farm. So we need to think about those risks as well. The same thing with the equipment you're using to harvest fish. You may have some of the farmers in Japan may have multiple ponds, and they'll use the same equipment and go from pond to pond to pond. And you could equate that to if you've got big holding tanks and you're moving the same equipment and moving from pond to pond, and the people are moving too, and they're splashed, and they can potentially spread disease. So we need to think about that. How do we mitigate that? There's our equipment, our nets, our tanks, our siphon hoses, everything. We need to think about that. That can potentially spread disease or introduce disease into our facility. Quarantine. Quarantine is really important. I harp on this a lot. My students probably get tired of me talking about it. But these are the procedures we use to hold fish separate from your main holding area to determine if they have disease. And there's typically a period of time that we like to do that. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But optimally, again, this is optimally. Everybody has to find what works for them. But the key elements of effective quarantine are having a dedicated area, optimally that's separated from where you hold the main part of your stock, or if you have a home system, you'd like to have a quarantine system that's separate. It should be signed, should have restricted access, and you want to do what's called all-in, all-out stocking, which means that you bring in all your new animals, you hold them, you're running through quarantine, and then you move them all out as a whole group before you move another group in. If you mix them and then you have a disease outbreak, it's very difficult to figure out where that came from. And that's really important if you're a producer or a retailer or an importer. You'd like to have the holding systems isolated and separated from the other holding systems. So for instance, a number of the facilities I work with, they have multiple suppliers, but each holding system is unique for that supplier, and they don't share water. And then you need to look at the animals regularly, and maybe even do some workups on the animals as well. There's just a little diagram to show, an optimal layout. So here you see where the queue, you've got, that's quarantine, then they would move into a separate holding area. This might be for a breeding facility, but you've got a separate holding area, and then you've got your display or your grow out. And then this one I put in, you can have a separate hospital too. If you've got really valuable animals that you think you might want to treat if they became ill, you could have a separate area. Optimally, that should be separate from quarantine. Sometimes it's not. Often it's not, but I just put it in there. Now, this is depicted it all in one building, but if you can separate them out, or even separate them out into different rooms, that actually reduces your risk even further. So here's some examples of different quarantine systems. My favorite is this one this is in Hawaii. So there's tilapia in there, and this actual facility isn't anywhere near any running water or free-flowing water, but I love the big chain link fence. Now that's really up there for people coming in and trying to take the fish, but when we first looked at it, we said, oh yeah, I worry about the tilapia going over the fence and getting back to the water. But you can see these other facilities, various states of types of construction materials that are used. Some I like better than others. I mean, this facility here that's in the middle on the top, that's all wood construction. I don't really like that because the wood is porous and it can get wet and pathogens can get into that wood. This facility's been up and running for 20 years and we've never had any major disease outbreaks because of the husbandry that's involved in managing that facility. And then you can just see some other sort of approaches to it. The one in the middle on the bottom is what our quarantine facility looked like at our facility for many years. It looks very different now, but actually not too different. But you can see we have dividers, so we don't have splash. Each of the tanks has their own water supply. Water goes in the tank and out of the tank. It doesn't share with the other ones. And then here's another large quarantine facility. This is in Australia, the one on the the lower right. Just gives you an idea of some approaches. Here's a quarantine facility. This is a retail store. So there's a small back room. This guy we worked with for a lot of years brings in the fish, quarantines them there before they go out on the floor. So, what do you quarantine? Well, everything, optimally. And optimally, again, everybody can't necessarily do this. You'd like to quarantine the fish separate from the invertebrates, separate from any plants. Why do we do that? Because a number of the intermediate stages of some of the parasites in particular can actually be harbored by the invertebrates or on the plants. And if you separate them out, those intermediate stages will hatch or come out of a resting stage, and there's no host, and then they die. And so you can interrupt the life cycle in that period. Here's sort of key elements that when we get a little more specific. Quarantine generally 2 to 4 weeks is optimal, especially with a tropical fish. And some people will say, well, we can't do that. Okay, if you can't do that, what can you do? And if you can't do it, can it be done farther back up the chain of custody or down the chain of custody? Those are things to think about. You need to look at the animals regularly for signs of disease and distress. One might argue this guy maybe missed something. We need to do some kind of disease surveillance. What does that mean? Well, if we know that there are particular diseases we're worried about and there are good validated diagnostic tests, we might want to consider subsampling some of the fish and doing some of those testing. When we identify a disease outbreak, we want to treat it as much as possible. Sometimes you'll have a disease outbreak and it's something that is of a significant enough concern that you won't treat it or you can't treat it and you just need to cull that group of fish. So I've had that happen a number of times when we're working with the koi producers where we've had, in one of the quarantine systems, we've had a koi herpes virus outbreak. We don't want any risk of that maintaining in your facility. So that's a situation where you wouldn't even try to treat it. Not that there's really an effective treatment for viral diseases, but that's something to think about. So, what you're trying to do in quarantine is either reduce the pathogen load, eliminate the pathogen load through treatments or other management protocols. And so here's just a general flow diagram of what we want to think about. You're sourcing your fish, reduce your number of sources, ask questions about how they do health management. Then you move them into quarantine, and we want to stick with all in, all out. That's optimal for what we want to do. And if you have quarantine started and you drop some new animals in, if you're following true protocols, your quarantine should go back to day 0, and you start over again. Then we move into our display or holding areas, and then we go to the customer or wherever we're going from there. Notice that I have X's through moving animals back. You really want your quarantine, your whole fish flow and animal flow to be a one-way. That's going to reduce your risk as much as possible. Okay, so let's talk about pathogen containment. These are the protocols that we use to contain diseases within a particular area of your facility when you have a disease outbreak. So again, let's go back to our goals: maximizing immunocompetence in the fish and reducing or eliminating potential disease agents. Okay, that's just good husbandry. That's what it is. It's good husbandry. So, and what we're trying to do as husbandry people, we're trying to balance the relationship between the fish and the environment, recognizing that the fish has certain aspects to it that make it resistant to disease or susceptible to disease. Its genetics, its age, its immune status shifts during the course of its life, its reproductive status, its overall body condition. Fish that are coming into a facility that are in poor body condition, it's more difficult for them to resist disease. And we need to think about the environment. What's our water quality? Our level of nutrition, the level of husbandry, potential pathogens. Potential pathogens are always in the fish and always in the environment, but healthy fishes will be able to resist that. Other animals, geology, actually what I should say is water source. We need to think about that again. Plants, I mentioned that already. You even need to think about your bioconverter bacteria. Well, that should say bioconverter bacteria. You need to think about that as well. If that's not healthy, you're not going to get a good nitrification. And if this is out of balance, that's when you get your disease situation. Okay. So another way I like to explain this is to think about the fish's immune system and, oops, what happened? All right. What I like to do is think about the fish's immune system and the pathogens in the system. So everything being equal, if the fish is healthy, it's going to move along. You're going to have pathogens in your system, but if that fish's immune system is healthy, they're not going to interact. You're going to have a healthy fish or healthy invertebrate. If we're in a situation where through water quality or some other thing, the pathogen loads increase, they can overwhelm a healthy fish's immune system. Or you can compromise the fish enough so that the pathogen that hasn't changed in its load in the system can cause disease. So it's this interaction. It's just another way I like to think about it. Where you have that cross is where you have the risk of disease. So was one of my professors in vet school, and he actually said this about cattle, but I just put in fish diseases. They're actually diseases of management that manifest themselves in the fish. This is where I get to, if I have to work, then we have an issue we have to address within the system. Also, bad management will overwhelm a fish's immune system, so we want to keep that in mind. So when we think about pathogen containment, we need to think about a strong fish health program. Isolated units, understand the risks within the facility. Where are my greatest risks? How can disease spread? Have excellent disease identification and management. Having somebody that has some extra training in fish health management is really useful. Have standard operating procedures, particularly if you're a bigger facility or a business. You need to have standard operating procedures that everybody understands. Excellent record keeping. We've heard that over and over. Ongoing staff training, that's really important because, and there's lots of studies that show this, if you're not doing that, people's attention to detail will begin to wane. And so the staff training is helping bring that back up again every time you do a training. And then have a quality assurance, quality control system. This can be very simple or it can be more elaborate. First thing is be able to recognize disease. When are your animals compromised? This is really important. And the earlier you can recognize this, the better. But also remember is what you see isn't always what's there, okay? So here's a picture. You're looking at a tank and you've got a sick fish. You notice a sick fish. That's what you see. Oh, I've got a couple sick fish. What's actually going on is you have that sick fish, and then you have a whole bunch of fish we say are subclinical that are about to break. So your problem is actually maybe worse than you think. And we call this sort of the iceberg theory, where you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and all those subclinical animals are where your biggest economic loss and costs are going to be, trying to manage those as they continue to break. So you're just seeing the most severe fish or severe animals oftentimes. And so this is where diagnostic testing or just having regular examination of your animals can be important. And really, in most situations, a microscope and a good dissecting kit can get you a lot of the way there. And a lot of people will say, well, microscopes are too expensive. No, really they're not. I mean, if anyone's interested, I can recommend to you a microscope that will more than get the job done for less than $250. And if you have that and a good dissecting kit, you're pretty well on your way to doing most of the management. And if you don't know what you see, we have all these really cool things now. We have, well, these are the things that you can see on the microscope. A lot of these common diseases you can pick up using the microscope. You may not know what it is, but if you take a picture of it, you can send it to somebody and we can help, and somebody can help you work through it. I mean, I get a lot of these things all the time. In fact, I was sitting in the back of the room this morning and I got little dings with things that, images that people wanted me to look at and make some recommendations on. And that's where your cell phone, a little digital camera can be really useful. So all the facilities I work with, we have these mounts that you can just slip your cell phone into the ocular, the eyepiece on the microscope, and you can take pictures or take HD video, and it works great. The other thing we want to think about is isolation. So here's a system. We've got a series of systems, series of tanks, little blue rectangles, and then the red lines between them represent the plumbing system. WS is just the water source. So what you see is water's coming in and it's moving through all those tanks. So you could imagine if one of those tanks developed a disease outbreak that was infectious, it could easily spread throughout the system. So how do you fix that? Well, you separate them. That reduces your risk a little bit. Or you plumb it in so that each tank gets its own water flow, and then the water goes out, is treated in some way, or it's just flow through, depending on where you are and what your capabilities are. You've reduced your risk even more. The other thing is figuring out where can the pathogens hide and understanding that within your system. Well, they can be on the fish and invertebrates themselves. That's pretty obvious. They can be in your system water, moving around. They can be in the substrates. They can be on the equipment. We call those fomites. Or they can be on or in vectors, which are other organisms, typically parasites, that can spread infectious diseases amongst the animals. And then those things are related to transmission. So your water can transmit disease between animals. You can have airborne. A lot of people forget that. If you look at the picture on the bottom with the droplet of water with all the little droplets going up into the air, that's actually a way that diseases can transfer. If you have tanks that are heavily aerated and there's no covers on them, then you can actually have those little water droplets move. And there was a really interesting study done at Cornell where they showed with a couple diseases, you could, and a little tiny fan, like a ventilation fan or something in a room, you could move a disease about 3 feet in those little water droplets. So you could easily spread it throughout a facility that way. There's the fish-to-fish, the vectors. You can see some of the parasites on there, lots of evidence and proof in many cases that these parasites can move diseases around. Good parasite control becomes important. The fomites, inanimate objects, if they're not properly cleaned and disinfected, that can be an issue as well. And then the food. I mentioned that earlier when we were talking about exclusion, pathogen exclusion. Those are things to think about. Here's some examples of how we prevent airborne and waterborne transmission, having lids. This tank on the bottom here, it doesn't look like it, but there's actually a plexiglass cover over that as well. And then we've got splash guards between the tanks. Tanks on the top all have covers on them. And the splash guards can be really simple. I mean, this is probably 10 years ago now, but the bottom right is actually what one of our systems used to look like, just to reduce splash. The other thing we need to think about are management procedures. So we need to have written standard operating procedures, good record keeping, regular cleaning of the holding systems, regular health monitoring of the fish. All these need to be prescribed. Regular staff training, it's really important. And then have a QA/QC program. And that could be as simple as, I want the tanks siphoned at this day and initials when they're done on a checklist. And if they're not initialed, then you don't know that it's done, and you go back and find who was supposed to do that. Same thing, when do we need to change out our UV bulbs? When do we need to change out pumps? That kind of thing. Or check the pumps, check seals and things like that. And having them written down, these are just examples of different checklists and things to lay out these procedures. A lot of facilities have a number of people that work in them, especially the larger facilities, that may or may not, English may not be their first language. So you need to think about ways that you can relay that information, relay the procedures in a more graphical form. So these are just some examples of different things that have been done to illustrate particular points. And then I put up, here's a graphic on how to make a jam sandwich. You need to think about that too. If people can't read my SOPs, how can I get that information across? So you want to find what works. Less extensive health management if you can't really do really intensive, can't afford it. Quality source fish, have good staff, good training, have your SOPs laid out, identify and remove your dead or moribund fish right away. Moribund is just sick fish. Those are actually excellent fish to examine. Have acclimation protocols, have excellent husbandry between lots of fish, and then practice this all in and all out. Some of those basic things will get you quite a ways there. And doing something is really better than nothing, and is really the key. It's really difficult after you've had an outbreak to put in a procedure. It's a lot more expensive. And also you need to understand, though, is that once you have your biosecurity and fish health management program put in place, it's not set in stone, it's dynamic. You're gonna change it, responding to changing conditions within your facility, but also new information. Just as I mentioned, these new emerging viruses that we're finding now, they've probably been around for a while, but now we can identify them. So if we can identify them and they're important enough in particular areas of the industry, and we have a diagnostic test available, maybe we want to implement those. So as information changes, you want to be willing to modify your protocols. Good fish health management is going to really protect your business. It really gets at, is one of the keys to sustainability, but most importantly, it's protecting your livestock. It's protecting the animals, because a good program means you're going to have healthy fish with healthy immune systems, and if they have healthy immune systems, they can fight off the invaders, okay? They're going to be ready for it, and a fish that is really healthy, good immune system, good plane of husbandry, can pretty much fight off anything, okay? And with that, thank you very much, and I'll answer any questions.